"You missed a spot, rookie." The words cut clean across the training floor, not loud, not shouted, but sharp enough to stop motion mid-breath as a few heads turned, and a couple of low chuckles slipped out before anyone could pretend they hadn't heard it. And Marcus Reed didn't look up right away, his hands still moving slow and steady across the polished gym floor with a damp cloth that smelled faintly of bleach and rubber. The overhead fluorescent lights reflecting in long white streaks across the surface he had just cleaned, his reflection bending and straightening with each pass like it didn't quite belong to him yet, like the badge clipped to his chest still needed permission to exist there. And across the room, Officer Daniel Hayes leaned casually against a row of lockers, arms folded, posture loose in the way of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged, watching Marcus the way people watch something temporary, something expected to fade out on its own, and somewhere behind him a pair of rookies shifted their weight, boots squeaking lightly against the floor, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet, choosing silence but not stepping in, never stepping in, because this was how things worked here. This was how the first day always began for someone like Marcus, not with instruction, not with guidance, but with a quiet test of how much weight a person could carry without breaking posture. And Marcus finally lifted his gaze just enough to meet Hayes' reflection in the floor rather. Then his eyes, a subtle choice, a controlled one, his breathing even, shoulders relaxed, no tension rising to the surface even as the room seemed to lean in waiting for something to happen, for him to react, to push back, to give them a reason to define him before he had the chance to define himself. And Hayes pushed off the lockers, slow deliberate steps echoing in soft rhythm as he crossed the distance, stopping just short of Marcus. Close enough that the air shifted, close enough that the message didn't need to be repeated, first day and already falling behind. He added, tone smooth, almost conversational, like this wasn't about cleaning at all, like it was about something older, something unspoken but deeply understood, and Marcus straightened just slightly, not fully standing, just enough to acknowledge the presence without surrendering the space he occupied, his fingers tightening briefly around the cloth before loosening again, control returning in the smallest motion, the kind no one notices unless they're looking for it. And no one here was, not really, not yet, because to them he was already a conclusion, already a category, already written into a story they had told 100 times before. But Marcus didn't move to defend himself, didn't explain, didn't rush. He simply nodded once, slow and measured, and went back to wiping the same spot with deliberate care, as if the floor mattered, as if the act itself held weight beyond what anyone else could see. And for a brief second something in the room shifted, not loudly, not enough to name, just a flicker in the rhythm of breath and silence, like the beginning of something none of them expected, something they weren't ready to recognize yet. And Hayes watched him a moment longer than necessary before turning away, but the faint crease in his brow lingered, barely there, like a question he hadn't meant to ask. The locker room smelled like cold metal and detergent, the kind that clung to the air long after the floors had dried, and Marcus Reed stood alone near the end of the narrow aisle, fingers resting lightly on the edge of an open locker that was not really his yet, just a temporary space with a borrowed number taped unevenly to the door, the adhesive already peeling at the corners like it knew it would not last. And around him voices moved in low currents, not loud enough to be direct, not quiet enough to ignore, fragments of conversation slipping between the clatter of boots and the dull thud of locker doors closing. "He is not going to last," someone muttered, followed by a soft exhale that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. And Marcus did not turn, did not react. He simply reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a neatly folded uniform shirt, the fabric crisp, edges aligned with care that spoke of habit rather than urgency, and for a moment his hands paused against the cloth, thumb brushing the seam as if grounding himself in something familiar, something earned long before this room, long before these voices. And the memory came not as a full image but as a feeling, the faint echo of a small apartment kitchen lit by a single warm bulb, the quiet hum of an old refrigerator, his mother's voice steady and soft, telling him that strength was not something you proved to people who had already decided who you were. Strength was what you carried when no one was looking. And the sound faded as quickly as it arrived, replaced again by the present, by the sharp snap of a locker door slamming somewhere to his left, making the metal walls tremble just enough to ripple the reflection of light across the floor, and Marcus exhaled slowly, folding the shirt once more before placing it inside the locker instead of putting it on, choosing patience over immediacy, choosing to observe before stepping fully into a space that had already begun to define him without his permission. And at the far end of the room, Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against the doorway, arms crossed again, posture unchanged, watching not directly, but through the reflection in the mirror mounted above the sinks, a practiced habit of someone who preferred control without confrontation, and their eyes did not meet, not fully, but the awareness passed between them anyway, subtle and unspoken, like a line drawn without a hand to trace it, and a younger recruit brushed past Marcus without slowing, shoulder nearly grazing his, but not quite, the hesitation deliberate, the distance measured, and Marcus stepped back half an inch to give space, not out of submission but out of choice, the kind of choice that did not ask for acknowledgement, and he reached for the small metal hook inside the locker where a thin chain hung loosely, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and from it he lifted a worn key ring, turning it once between his fingers before letting it fall back into place, the faint clink barely audible beneath the noise of the room. And then he closed the locker door gently, not with force, not with hesitation, just enough pressure to let it click into place. And in that quiet sound there was something steady, something controlled, something that did not belong to the expectations filling the room. And as he turned to step back toward the training floor, the overhead lights flickered once, briefly, casting a soft shadow across his face before stabilizing again. And for a fraction of a second the space felt suspended, like the pause before something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the way everything after it will be seen. Volume, control, awareness, discipline. Each word landing evenly, spaced like markers on a line, and a few recruits nodded subtly, eager to align themselves with the expectation, eager to be seen as ready, and Walker's eyes moved across them again before settling briefly on Marcus, not with judgment, not with approval, just observation, pure and unfiltered. And then he gestured toward the center of the floor where a pair of training mats had been laid out in precise alignment, edges parallel, corners sharp, nothing out of place. And Hayes stepped forward to take position beside the mats, his voice cutting in smooth and confident. "We are going to run partner drills," he said, glancing back at the line. "Pair up," and immediately the room shifted, small movements turning into quick decisions, recruits stepping toward each other, forming pairs with minimal hesitation, some exchanging brief nods, others offering tight smiles that did not quite reach their eyes, and within seconds the lights above flickered once again, casting a brief shadow between them before settling back into place. And in that small moment of dimmed light the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name. The mat felt cooler than the rest of the floor, a thin layer of vinyl stretched tight over padding that barely gave under pressure, and Marcus Reed stepped onto it with quiet precision, his shoes making almost no sound as he stopped across from Officer Daniel Hayes, leaving just enough space between them to respect the boundary, but not enough to suggest distance. His posture relaxed but aligned, shoulders level, hands resting loosely at his sides as if he had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. And around them the room settled into a careful stillness, the other pairs slowing, their movements softening, attention drifting without fully turning, because no one wanted to be seen watching, but no one wanted to miss what might happen next. And Hayes adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves with slow, deliberate motions, not rushing, not speaking, letting the silence stretch just long enough to press against the edges of the moment. His eyes fixed on Marcus now without disguise, without reflection, studying him in a way that was less about instruction and more about definition, as if he was deciding what category to place him in before the exercise even began. And then Hayes stepped forward half a pace, stopping just inside the invisible line that separated demonstration from confrontation, his voice low but carrying. "This is basic control," he said, glancing briefly toward the rest of the room as if including them, but his attention never left Marcus. "You follow my lead. You understand?" And the question did not sound like a question. It sounded like an expectation already answered, and Marcus met his gaze fully for the first time, not challenging, not lowering, just steady, his breathing even, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that did not match the tension in the room, and he gave a small nod, measured and calm. "Yes, sir." His voice quiet but clear, the words landing without hesitation, without resistance, and Hayes tilted his head slightly, as if the simplicity of the response did not quite satisfy him, as if he had been waiting for something sharper, something easier to push against, but it did not come, and for a moment there was nothing but the faint hum of the lights and the distant shuffle of movement from the other pairs who had resumed just enough to avoid standing still, and Hayes exhaled through his nose, a subtle shift, then raised one hand in a controlled motion, demonstrating the starting position without fully committing to it, his movements precise, practiced, the kind that came from repetition rather than thought, and Marcus mirrored the stance without delay, matching the alignment but not the tension, his weight balanced evenly, feet grounded in a way that suggested familiarity beyond instruction, though nothing in his expression revealed it, and Hayes noticed the smallest flicker crossing his eyes before it disappeared, replaced again by that same calm certainty, and he stepped closer, testing the space, testing the response, not with force but with presence, and Marcus adjusted by inches, not retreating, not advancing, simply maintaining the line between them with quiet awareness, and somewhere near the edge of the mat a recruit shifted position, the soft squeak of rubber against vinyl echoing louder than it should have, drawing a brief glance from Sergeant Cole Walker, who had not moved since taking his place near the wall, his arms still crossed, his gaze steady, watching, not just the action but the choices inside it, the pauses, the restraint, the control that did not announce itself. And back on the mat, Hayes lowered his hand slowly, studying Marcus as if waiting for something to slip, something to reveal itself without being asked. But Marcus remained exactly where he was, present but contained, like a line drawn in water that refused to break, and the air between them felt tighter now, not heavy, not aggressive, just charged with a quiet expectation, the kind that builds before something shifts. And as the overhead lights flickered once more, casting a brief shadow across their faces, neither of them moved. And in that suspended second the entire room seemed to lean forward without taking a step. Hayes moved first, not with speed but with intent, a subtle shift of weight that pressed into the space between them like a quiet challenge, his hand rising again, closer this time, testing boundaries rather than demonstrating them. And Marcus Reed did not step back, did not flinch, he simply adjusted his stance by a fraction, feet grounding deeper into the mat, shoulders staying loose, eyes steady, tracking not the movement itself but the rhythm behind it. And around them the room tightened, conversations fading into a low hum, the other recruits slowing without stopping, their attention drifting in controlled glances, each of them aware that this was no longer just a drill, not in the way it had started. And Hayes circled half a step, angling his body, forcing Marcus to respond without words, forcing him to choose direction, to reveal instinct, and Marcus turned with him smoothly, not reacting, not anticipating too early, just staying present in the moment as it unfolded, and Hayes let out a quiet breath through his nose, something between patience and irritation, then shifted again, faster this time, closing the distance by inches, enough to test control, enough to demand a response, and Marcus moved with it, a small pivot, a controlled adjustment that kept the line intact without breaking posture, his hands still relaxed, not raised in defense, not reaching forward, just ready without appearing ready. And Hayes paused, studying him, the silence stretching again, heavier now, layered with something sharper beneath it, and a faint murmur rose from the edge of the room before being swallowed quickly, as if the space itself refused to let it grow. And Hayes spoke again, his voice lower now, directed only at Marcus. "You waiting for permission?" The words soft but edged, designed to provoke without volume, and Marcus held his gaze, calm, measured. "No, sir." The response immediate but controlled. No challenge in it. No submission either, just clarity, and Hayes leaned in slightly, closing the gap another inch, his presence pressing forward like a question that demanded more than a simple answer. "Then show me something," he said, not loud, not aggressive, but firm, and for a moment nothing moved, not Hayes, not Marcus, not even the air between them. And then Marcus shifted, not forward, not back, just enough to reset his balance, his breath steadying, his focus narrowing, and he mirrored Hayes' position more clearly now, not as imitation but as alignment, as if acknowledging the structure of the exercise without surrendering to the pressure behind it. And Hayes watched closely, waiting for excess, for overreach, for anything that would justify the tension he had been building. But it did not come, and instead Marcus remained contained, controlled, his movements precise but minimal, offering nothing unnecessary, nothing reactive, and that restraint seemed to irritate more than defiance would have, because it gave Hayes nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to dominate, and the room felt it, that shift, subtle but real, like a current changing direction beneath still water. And Sergeant Cole Walker's gaze sharpened slightly from the wall, his arms still crossed, his posture unchanged, but his attention now fully fixed on the mat, not just observing but measuring something deeper than technique. And Hayes took another step, testing again, pushing the boundary of space without crossing into anything that could be called improper, his movements deliberate, controlled, but edged with something personal now, something unspoken. And Marcus met it the same way he had met everything else, with quiet steadiness, no escalation, no retreat, just presence. And in that balance, in that refusal to break rhythm, the tension reached its peak, not in noise, not in motion, but in the absence of both. And for a brief second the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to give, something to reveal which direction this moment would turn. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the training floor like a thin layer of dust that no one dared to disturb. And Marcus Reed stood in the center of it, unmoving, his breath slow and even, his chest rising just enough to remind him he was still here, still present, while everything around him seemed to hold its position, suspended between expectation and outcome. And across from him Officer Daniel Hayes remained just as still, but there was a difference now. Something subtle in the way his shoulders held tension, something almost imperceptible in the narrowing of his eyes, like he was no longer waiting for Marcus to react, but trying to understand why he had not. And the overhead lights hummed softly, a faint electrical buzz that filled the gaps where voices used to be, casting a pale glow across the mat that reflected upward in muted streaks, outlining the stillness of both men without favoring either one. And somewhere near the edge of the room a shoe shifted, the rubber sole pressing lightly against the floor with a soft squeak that echoed louder than it should have. But no one turned to look, no one moved to reset the moment, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone by noise. And Marcus let his gaze soften slightly, not lowering it, not breaking eye contact, just easing the focus as his breathing slowed even further, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled. And for a brief second the room seemed to fade at the edges, the fluorescent light dimming into something warmer, something quieter, and in that space his mind reached back not to words but to presence, to the memory of standing barefoot on worn wooden floors, the faint scent of polish and sweat in the air, his instructor's voice steady and calm, not teaching him how to strike, not teaching him how to win, but teaching him how to wait, how to hold space without filling it, how to recognize the moment before action and choose not to take it. And the memory passed through him like a breath, leaving behind not nostalgia but clarity. And when the room came back into focus nothing had moved, nothing had escalated, but everything felt different, sharper, more defined, as if the silence itself had drawn a line that could no longer be crossed without consequence. And Hayes shifted first, not forward, not backward, just a slight adjustment of his stance, a small release of pressure that suggested something internal had changed, something unspoken but real, and Marcus mirrored it in equal measure, not copying, not responding, simply maintaining the balance that had formed between them. And from the far wall Sergeant Cole Walker uncrossed his arms slowly, the motion deliberate, almost quiet in its own right, his clipboard lowering slightly at his side, as his gaze remained fixed on the two figures at the center, not with surprise, not with approval, but with recognition, as if he had been waiting to see whether something genuine would surface beneath the structure of the exercise. And now it had, not in force, not in speed, but in restraint, in control that did not demand attention yet commanded it anyway. And the room began to breathe again, slowly at first, a faint shift in posture here, a quiet step there, but no one spoke, No one broke the moment with words, because the absence of them had already said more than enough, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, grounded, steady, his hands still relaxed at his sides, his presence unchanged, and in that stillness there was something undeniable, something that did not need to be announced or proven, something that simply existed, waiting for the next movement to reveal what it already knew. Hayes moved again, but this time the movement was different, less measured, less patient, a shift that carried intention beyond instruction. His foot stepping in with a sharper edge, his shoulder angling forward as if to force the moment to resolve, and for the first time the space between them collapsed from inches into contact range, not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but undeniable in its pressure. And Marcus Reed responded without delay, not with speed, not with force, but with precision so quiet it almost disappeared inside the motion itself, his body turning just enough to redirect the line of approach, his hand rising not to strike but to guide, to meet the movement and soften it. And in one fluid sequence that lasted no more than a breath, he shifted Hayes off balance without breaking posture, without creating impact, just a subtle change in direction that ended with Hayes stepping wide to regain footing, his weight displaced, his rhythm interrupted, and the room felt it. Immediately, the difference, the clarity of what had just happened, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its execution, and a sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere near the back before it was swallowed by silence again. And Hayes straightened slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly, eyes narrowing as he recalibrated, not humiliated, not defeated, but surprised in a way he had not expected to feel here, not on this floor, not with someone he had already decided he understood, and Marcus did not step forward, did not press the advantage. He simply returned to neutral, feet grounded, hands lowering again to his sides, his breathing unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if the moment had passed through him without leaving a mark, and that restraint, that refusal to escalate, carried more weight than the movement itself, because it left no room for interpretation, no room for dismissal. It simply existed as fact. And Sergeant Cole Walker took a single step forward from the wall, the soft sound of his boot against the floor cutting through the stillness like a quiet signal, his clipboard lowering fully now, his gaze fixed on Marcus for a fraction longer than before shifting briefly to Hayes, measuring both without speaking, and Hayes exhaled slowly, a controlled release that reset his posture, his stance returning to alignment. But something in his expression had changed, the certainty softened, replaced by a sharper awareness. And he nodded once, not fully, not openly, but enough to acknowledge what had just occurred. And Marcus met it with the same calm presence he had held from the beginning. No satisfaction, no pride, just steadiness. And around them the other recruits had stopped entirely now, their drills forgotten, their attention fixed without pretense, because the line that had been invisible before was visible now, clear and undeniable, drawn not by words but by action. And the overhead lights flickered once more, casting a brief shimmer across the mat, and in that moment of shifting light the entire room seemed to settle into a new understanding, not spoken, not announced, but felt in the quiet space between breath and movement, where the truth of what had just happened could not be undone. No one spoke when Sergeant Cole Walker stepped fully onto the mat, but the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, like a line being drawn without sound. And Marcus Reed remained where he was, posture unchanged, breath steady, while Officer Daniel Hayes stood a few feet away, shoulders squared yet no longer rigid. Something in his stance loosened not from defeat, but from recognition. And Walker's eyes moved between them slowly, not searching for fault, not measuring dominance, but reading the space that had formed in the absence of noise, the kind of space that only appeared when something real had taken place. And he stopped just off-center, his boots making a soft, deliberate contact with the mat, the faint echo grounding the moment. And when he spoke his voice was calm, even, carrying without force. "That is enough," he said, not as a command but as a conclusion. And the words settled over the room like a quiet release, not breaking the tension but reshaping it into something steadier, something understood. And Hayes exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to carry more weight than anything he had said earlier. his gaze shifting back to Marcus, not with the sharp edge it held before, but with a measured clarity, as if he was seeing him for the first time without the filter he had placed there at the start of the day. And for a brief second the two men stood in that shared space, no longer opposing, no longer testing, just present, and Hayes gave a small nod, restrained but unmistakable, the kind of acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken to be heard, and Marcus returned it in equal measure, no more, no less, his expression calm, grounded, offering nothing beyond the moment itself. And around them the other recruits shifted subtly, their attention no longer hidden, their posture adjusting as if recalibrating what they thought they understood. And Walker turned slightly, addressing the room now, his gaze sweeping across the line of recruits who had quietly gathered closer without realizing it. Control is not about force, he said, his tone steady. It is about choice, each word landing clean, deliberate, leaving no space for misinterpretation. And he paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before continuing. You do not prove strength by using it. You prove it by knowing when you do not have to. And the silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not waiting, but absorbing, as if the room itself was taking in the weight of what had just been witnessed. And Hayes stepped back then, clearing the center of the mat without hesitation, his movement simple, unforced. And in doing so he gave Marcus space without making it an event, without drawing attention to it. And that small gesture carried more weight than anything that had come before, because it was not about instruction, it was about recognition, and Marcus did not linger, did not look around for validation. He simply stepped back as well, returning to his place with the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning. His shoulders relaxed, his gaze forward, and the overhead lights steadied into a constant glow. No flicker now, no interruption, just a quiet, even illumination that reflected across the floor in smooth lines. And in that calm, settled light the room found its rhythm again, but not the same rhythm it had before. Something had shifted, something subtle but permanent, and no one needed to say it out loud for it to be real. The training floor returned to motion in quiet fragments, pairs stepping back into their drills with a new kind of care, movements slower, more deliberate, as if something unseen had reset the standard without anyone needing to announce it. And Marcus Reed moved with them, not at the center now, not singled out, just another figure in the line, his posture steady, his breathing even, his focus directed forward as if the moment before had already passed and no longer needed to be held. And the faint squeak of rubber soles resumed its rhythm, echoing softly against the high ceiling, blending with the low hum of the lights that now burned steady without flicker, casting clean reflections across the polished surface. And across the room, Officer Daniel Hayes stood near the edge of the mat, arms no longer crossed, his stance relaxed but attentive, watching the recruits not with the same sharp edge as before, but with a quieter awareness, his gaze drifting once toward Marcus and holding there for a brief second before moving on, not dismissing, not challenging, simply acknowledging. And that single glance carried a weight that did not need to be repeated. And Sergeant Cole Walker remained near the wall, his clipboard raised again, pen moving in small, precise strokes as he noted something unseen to the others, his expression unchanged. But the slight pause between each mark suggested he was writing more than just performance. He was recording presence, decision, control, and Marcus stepped through the next sequence of drills with the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning, his movements clean, efficient, nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated, and when his partner adjusted, he adjusted. When the rhythm shifted, he followed, never forcing, never resisting, just aligning with the flow as it unfolded, and the room responded in kind, the earlier tension dissolving into something quieter, something steadier, as if the space itself had recalibrated around a new center. And no one laughed now, no one whispered. The silence that remained was not empty, but filled with understanding, the kind that settles in after something real has been seen. And near the end of the session the whistle sounded once, sharp and clear, cutting through the room and bringing the movement to a gradual stop. And the recruits lined up again without being told, their spacing more precise, their posture more aligned, each of them standing just a little differently than they had at the start. And Marcus took his place at the end of the line, shoulders relaxed, gaze forward, his uniform catching the overhead light in a soft, even sheen, and Hayes stepped forward briefly, stopping a few feet in front of the line, his voice calm when he spoke. Good work. Simple words, evenly delivered, but when his eyes passed over Marcus, there was no edge left in them, only clarity, and then he stepped back without adding anything more, without needing to, and Walker gave a short nod, signaling the end.